This is Weeki Wachee Springs. Located about 40 miles north of Tampa, this spring discharges upwards of 100 million gallons of fresh water every single day. That water travels a little over 7 miles down the snaking Weeki Wachee River before emptying out into the Gulf of Mexico. It is just one of over 700 springs located in the state of Florida. Yet this one is special because, you see, Weeki Wachee Springs is home to mermaids. Up until 1946, the spring served as a backup water supply for nearby Tampa and St. Petersburg. But that changed when a group of 4 businessmen set their sights on Weeki Wachee. W.D. Snyder and Walton Hall Smith of Kansas City, both ex-Navy commanders, Hal Messenger of Los Angeles, and Robert Hillman of New York City, an advertising executive, all went in together on purchasing a 25-year lease for the spring with the intent of developing it into a roadside attraction. There were plenty of other springs in the state, but Weeki Wachee was particularly stunning. The water was crystal clear, teeming with life, and regardless of the season, a consistent 72 to 74 degrees. On the colder end, sure, but still swimmable. Beyond that, it extended down over 400 feet. This combination of qualities is what led to it being advertised as an underwater mountain. And it's what made the spring particularly alluring to these 4 men looking to start a business. To develop the attraction, they turned to a man by the name of Newton Perry. Perry had grown up in Florida and from a young age was an avid swimmer. He spent his days as a child swimming in springs just like Weeki Wachee, and it led to a high school and college career in competitive swimming while teaching lessons on the side for money. In 1939, that love of swimming proved useful when he was hired as a consultant and stuntman for MGM's latest film, Tarzan Finds a Son. His penchant for diving, especially, made him a useful trainer when it came to underwater scenes. In 1941, he would do the same, this time with Tarzan's Secret Treasure. Perry was a diving natural and no stranger to Floridian springs, and so he had big plans for Weeki Wachee. Announced in the summer of 1947 and planned to open later that fall, the project was originally estimated at $100,000, with an additional $500,000 investment shortly after. Weeki Wachee was originally designed to offer a jungle cruise boat ride down the river, as well as a zoo area that would contain an alligator display, snake pits, sea turtles, hippos, and manatees. It would also offer a white sand beach for guests and a picnic and playground areas for families. The real highlight of Weeki Wachee Springs, however, was the underwater theater. Originally pitched as an underwater lounge, the 18-person theater was built into the ground and on the edge of the spring and featured quartz windows that looked directly into the water. This would give guests the ability to watch the wildlife under the water and take photos. The theater would also be where guests would watch what they called at the time underwater ballets and pageants. Perry wanted to go one step further beyond the already popular display of synchronized swimming, and he wanted to do it by staging the numbers under the water. With the amusement being built for a fall opening, the stars would then align, and in the process it presented Weeki Wachee with an opportunity that would help launch the attraction. See, that same year, Universal was in the process of adapting the 1945 novel Peabody's Mermaid into a film. The movie, titled Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid, would star William Powell and Anne Blythe. The story followed Arthur Peabody, played by Powell, as he discovered a real-life mermaid, played by Blythe, while on vacation in the Caribbean. The concept obviously called for underwater mermaid sequences, and so Universal found themselves looking for a good location that was photogenic, large enough for a set, and allowed for filming underwater. Not to mention, it had to align with their shooting schedule, which was in December. While looking, they kept running past Newt Perry's name, who by that point was a known figure thanks to the Tarzan films. They reached out to him for help, and, well, what do you know? He was just in the middle of building an underwater theater at a photogenic, large natural spring that had consistently warm enough water to swim in. It was a perfect match. So Universal got to work at building a 56-foot by 36-foot stage that would eventually get trucked across the country to Florida and submerged into the spring. In an effort to really lean into the novelty of the situation when the film was finished the next year, Universal held their premiere at Weeki Wachee Springs, and the Springs held a Florida's Mermaid Queen contest during the event. The winner would receive a week-long, all-expense-paid vacation to, well, Weeki Wachee Springs. They even promoted the event by setting up a big water tank outside of a courthouse in Tampa where some of the mermaids put on smaller shows throughout the day for onlookers. With a nice publicity boost at launch, Weeki Wachee Springs spent the following decade picking up steam as a popular roadside attraction. People enjoyed these mermaid shows in which performers would do everything from small dances to staging everyday activities under the water like eating food or drinking soda. The mermaids would use an air hose, designed by Perry himself, in order to remain underwater for the entire show without ever having to resurface. It's also worth noting that while they were called mermaids and marketed as such, they weren't yet donning the iconic mermaid tails that we think of when we hear the word. But for as much as the attraction grew in the 1950s, its real golden era would arrive in the 1960s.
Weeki Wachee is the place to be. Weeki Wachee is the place to be.
At Weeki Wachee, if you think you see mermaids
Weeki Wachee,
floating in the waters of blue, don't rub your eyes in surprise that you see mermaids, because at Weeki Wachee you do.
In 1959, the Weeki Wachee Springs was purchased by Florida State Theaters, a local company that owned a number of movie theaters in the region. That company itself was owned by American Broadcasting Paramount Theaters Incorporated, a company that would eventually go by the name of ABC Television. With the increased financial backing of an owner like ABC, the underwater theater, which had expanded over the years from 18 seats to 100, was expanded once more to hold 500 guests. The upgrade, priced at $1 million, also included the largest installation of underwater speakers in the country at the time. It allowed the mermaids performing to hear musical cues in their shows. That, in turn, allowed them to put on increasingly complex shows. Some of them, like Mermaids on the Moon, were original productions, while others were adaptations of popular stories, such as Peter Pan, Snow White, Alice in Wonderland, and The Wizard of Oz. At their peak, the Weeki Wachee mermaids were performing between 8 and 9 underwater shows a day, to a reported 500,000 visitors every year. It was during the 60s that the mermaids began to wear the iconic tails that they still sport today, and the competition to become a mermaid grew. New mermaids had to undergo up to 6 weeks of training before they'd be able to appear in shows. That included everything from learning how to move, pose, and perform seemingly simple tasks with the right look, to airlock safety tests and deep water diving training. It's also when the mermaids finally started to get paid for their work. Up until their ownership by ABC, the mermaids had been working for free food and free bathing suits. The attraction was also growing enough in popularity to host special events. In 1964, it was picked as a premiere location for the Warner Brothers film The Incredible Mr. Limpet. Weeki Wachee spent around $16,000 or $133,000 today on the projection equipment needed to host the premiere. It wasn't cheap, but they gladly picked up the tab because the event resulted in writers from across the country attending who, along with the film, wrote about the Springs and the mermaid shows. Towards the end of the decade, however, things began to change, and Weeki Wachee Springs began to meet a fate that was all too common among roadside attractions in America. Up until that point, they had thrived off of the convenient placement of US 19. The Springs were a natural pit stop for anyone driving to or from the Tampa area. But with the completion of I-75 20 miles to the east, Weeki Wachee went from an amusement right off the side of the road to a detour over half an hour away. It might not sound like much, but it was enough to impact the number of people visiting. In 1971, Walt Disney World opened to the public and was a bit of a game changer. On the one hand, the allure of a Disney theme park introduced a competitor to Floridian roadside attractions that could not be beat. It was an East Coast Disneyland after all. On the other hand, the opening of Disney began to turn Central Florida into a tourism hotspot, and it brought more visitors into the state than ever before. Being under a 2-hour drive away from the Magic Kingdom, Weeki Wachee was among the many attractions that could easily be tacked onto a family vacation to Florida. Then, in 1982, that changed.
Epcot Center represents the culmination of more than 25 million hours of effort by talented artists, designers, engineers, and technicians.
With the opening of Epcot Center, Disney's role as a tourism leader in Florida began to change. Slowly, Disney went from one stop out of many during a family vacation in Florida to being, well, the Florida vacation. It would only amplify towards the end of the 80s and 90s as not only more Disney parks opened, but more theme parks in Orlando opened to compete with Disney. Before long, these roadside attractions went from being the highlights of a family vacation to being sleepy and often forgotten novelties. During those years, the ownership of Weeki Wachee Springs changed hands multiple times, and at points those running the attraction tried to get creative to keep it afloat. In 2004, the park managers were able to shop the amusement around to reality shows, and as a result, it was featured on an episode of the Paris Hilton-Nicole Richie show, The Simple Life. When times were tough, the community of mermaid performers and locals often helped each other. In 2004, the Mermaids also formed a campaign called Save Our Tails, and people like the Weeki Wachee mayor donated their salary to the campaign to help support the Mermaids. Then, in 2008, ownership of the springs reverted to the town of Weeki Wachee, who in turn donated the springs to the state of Florida. It was at that point that Weeki Wachee Springs became Weeki Wachee Springs State Park. Overnight, the Mermaids became government-employed mermaids, and the attraction received the backing needed to keep going. These days, Weeki Wachee Springs is still around, and the famous mermaid shows from the late 1940s are still its main attraction. The role of mermaid is as challenging as ever, and it takes new mermaids 4 months of training before they're ready to perform for the public. In an interesting way, the attraction's dedication to this classic staple of a show is what keeps it on the map. Without it, it's just another one of the countless state springs that locals and tourists alike can visit to swim in. And had they tried to chase a new fad or emulate a competitor, they might have just failed and faded into obscurity. But by sticking to this unique idea, through the good times and the bad, they swam out on the other end with a tradition that is now nearly 75 years old, and a historic part of Central Florida.
For America's great traveling circuses who spend their winters in Florida. But there's one circus that stays year-round on Florida's west coast. The world's only underwater circus at Weeki Wachee Springs, Florida's underwater Grand Canyon. Here are the stars of this great show, the Weeki Wachee Mermaids.